That was the day nothing happened, and everything changed. The woman would say it decades later, her fingers resting lightly on the collar of her coat, as if remembering the weight of fabric, the quiet protection it once gave her. But in March of 1945, in a gray British prisoner compound just outside Bremen, there was no poetry in the air, only cold wind measuring at 38 degrees, damp enough to settle into bone, and a yard of packed dirt turned dark by overnight rain, where 30 German women stood in a loose formation, boots sunk half an inch into mud, their breath visible in short, controlled bursts, each one holding still in a way that was not taught by training but chosen in the moment, because something had shifted before anyone said a word, something in the tone of the order that had been passed down without a name, without a face, just a routine instruction delivered by a corporal reading from a clipboard like it was weather, like it meant nothing. And yet every woman there understood it meant everything, not in the physical sense, not in any obvious threat, but in the quiet erosion of something they had already lost too much of. And so they did not move, not when the guards looked up expecting compliance, not when the seconds stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable, not even when one of the younger soldiers shifted his weight and cleared his throat as if to push the moment forward. Because this was no longer about orders or consequences. It was about a line that had not been spoken but was suddenly clear to all of them. And Anna Weiss stood at the front not because she had been chosen, but because she did not step back. Her shoulders squared not in defiance but in steadiness, her hands still at her sides, fingers slightly curled from the cold. And when she spoke it was not loud, not dramatic, just 3 words in careful English. We won't comply. And the sound of it did not echo, did not rise, it simply landed, flat and undeniable, like something placed gently but firmly on a table that no one could ignore. And the guards did not react the way they had been trained to react. There was no immediate correction, no barked command, only a pause that grew heavier with each passing second, because they were not facing chaos or resistance in the usual sense. They were facing stillness, collective and deliberate, and it unsettled them more than noise ever could. One guard glanced at another, waiting for someone higher to take control, but no one moved, and the yard, already quiet, seemed to press in tighter around them, until the distant sound of boots on gravel approached from behind the administrative building, measured steps, even and unhurried, and Captain Edward Hale entered the yard without announcement, his coat buttoned against the cold, his cap low, his expression unreadable not because he hid it, but because he had not yet decided what it should be. And he did not ask what was happening, not immediately. Instead he looked, really looked, at the formation, at the rigid line of women who refused to shift even an inch, at the guards whose posture had subtly changed from authority to uncertainty. And then he asked one question, simple, almost quiet. Who gave that order? And the corporal with the clipboard hesitated, flipping a page that offered no answer. Because the truth was there was no clear origin, no signed directive, just an assumption passed along the chain until it became something real. And in that moment the absence of authority became visible, tangible, like a gap no one could bridge, and Hale stood there, absorbing it, the cold air, the silence, the weight of expectation from both sides, and he understood something that was not written in any manual. That power, when undefined, reveals itself in the choices made in its absence. And he could feel the decision forming not as a reaction but as a recognition that nothing irreversible had happened yet, that the line remained intact simply because no one had crossed it, and that crossing it would not enforce order but diminish it. And so he nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging a thought only he could hear, and said, "Then it doesn't exist." And there was no emphasis, no raised tone, just a statement placed into the same still air that had held everything else. And for a moment nothing changed outwardly. The women did not move, the guards did not speak. The yard remained exactly as it had been. But something internal shifted, like pressure released without sound, and Hale turned, not dramatically, not as a gesture, but simply because there was nothing left to do, and began walking back toward the building, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the damp ground. And only then did the formation break, not in relief or reaction, but in quiet acknowledgement, shoulders lowering by degrees, breath deepening, the smallest movements returning to bodies that had held themselves still against something unseen, and Anna Weiss did not smile, did not look around for confirmation. She simply exhaled, a long, steady breath she had been holding without realizing it. And in that breath was the understanding that nothing had happened, no confrontation, no spectacle, no visible act of defiance or force, and yet everything had changed, because for the first time since the war had taken everything else from them, a line had remained uncrossed, not by resistance, not by permission, but by choice. And that choice would follow them long after the yard emptied and the mud dried and the cold lifted, because it proved something quiet and unshakable, that dignity does not always come from what is done, but sometimes from what is refused. The yard did not return to normal, not immediately, because normal had quietly shifted into something unfamiliar, something none of them had language for. And as the women were dismissed in small groups and guided back toward the barracks, their steps were slower than before, not from exhaustion but from awareness, as if each movement now carried weight, carried memory, and Anna Weiss walked among them without speaking, her boots pressing into the same damp ground, leaving the same shallow impressions, yet feeling different with every step, because the silence they carried was no longer the silence of fear, but something steadier, something chosen, and behind them the guards remained in the yard longer than necessary, their formation looser now, their posture uncertain in a way that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with recognition, because they had witnessed something they could not easily categorize, not disobedience, not defiance, but restraint that had forced them to confront their own role in it. And one young guard, barely 20, lingered near the edge of the yard, his hands resting at his sides, replaying the moment in his mind, the way the words had been spoken without anger, the way the captain had responded without force, and he found himself asking a question. He had not asked since arriving in uniform, not what the rules required, but what they meant, and inside the barracks the air was warmer by a few degrees, the scent of wool and damp wood filling the space, and the women moved quietly, removing coats, sitting on bunks, not looking at one another immediately, because eye contact would have made it real too quickly, would have forced emotion into a moment that was still settling. And Anna sat on the edge of her bunk, her hands resting on her knees, her fingers still slightly numb, and she looked down at them as if they belonged to someone else, as if they had held something invisible and only now were beginning to release it. And across from her Greta Hoffman adjusted her scarf slowly, deliberately, her movements measured, and after a long moment she said, "He could have done nothing." Not as a question, not even as a statement, but as a realization spoken aloud so it would not disappear, and Anna nodded once, her gaze still lowered, because the truth of it was simple and heavy at the same time. He could have done nothing, and nothing would have been enough to change everything. And yet he had chosen something else, something smaller than an action and larger than a command, and that difference settled into the room like a quiet presence, shaping the space without announcing itself. And outside the administrative building, Captain Edward Hale stood alone for a moment longer than his schedule allowed, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed not on the yard but on the line where the ground met the low wooden fence. And he was not replaying the scene as a victory or a defiance of procedure. He was measuring it, weighing it against something internal that did not fit neatly into regulation or report, because he understood the risk not in terms of consequence but in terms of precedent, that a decision made once would echo in ways he could not fully control. And a lieutenant approached from behind, his footsteps quicker, more certain, carrying the energy of someone who believed clarity was always available if one asked the right question, and he stopped a few feet away, posture straight, voice controlled, and said, "Sir, may I ask why the inspection was halted?" And Hale did not turn immediately, allowing the question to exist in the space between them, and when he did respond his voice was even, almost quiet, because it was not necessary. And the lieutenant shifted slightly, processing the answer, because it did not resolve the tension he felt, did not provide the structure he expected, and he pressed once more, "But sir, the protocol." And Hale interrupted, not sharply, but with finality. Protocol is not a substitute for judgment. And the words settled with a weight that was not heavy but firm, like a line drawn without force. And the lieutenant nodded, not because he fully understood, but because he recognized the boundary had been set, and he stepped back, leaving Hale alone again. And inside the barracks the women had begun to speak in low voices, fragments of sentences, half-formed thoughts, not recounting the event but circling it, approaching it from different angles as if trying to understand its shape. And Anna finally looked up, meeting Greta's eyes, and there was no need for explanation, no need to revisit what had been said or done, because the meaning was already there, shared and understood, and in that shared understanding something shifted again, not dramatically, not in a way that would be noticed from outside, but internally, a recalibration of how they occupied the space, how they saw themselves within it, not as people who had been spared something, but as people who had held something and not let it be taken, and the difference between those two ideas was subtle but profound. And as the afternoon light began to fade, casting longer shadows across the barracks floor, the routine resumed, meals prepared, tasks assigned, the quiet rhythm of camp life continuing as it always had. And yet beneath that routine there was a new layer, something unspoken but present, a memory that did not fade with time but settled deeper, becoming part of how the day would be remembered not for what happened, but for what did not. And as evening approached and the temperature dropped again, the women prepared for rest, folding coats, adjusting blankets, and Anna lay back on her bunk, her eyes tracing the wooden beams above her, and she thought not of the order, not of the refusal, but of the moment in between, the moment when nothing had been decided yet, when the outcome was still open, and she realized that was where the change had truly begun, not in the words spoken or the decision made, but in the pause that allowed a different choice to exist at all. And she closed her eyes slowly, her breathing steady, and for the first time in many months the silence that followed was not something to endure, but something to rest inside. Morning came without announcement, just a gradual shift in light through the thin windows of the barracks, pale gray turning to a washed-out blue, and the cold remained, settling low along the floorboards, creeping into boots left beside bunks, into fingers that curled slightly before waking. And Anna Weiss opened her eyes before the others, not from rest but from habit, her body still tuned to uncertainty even after the quiet of the previous night. And for a moment she did not move, she simply listened, to the soft breathing around her, to the distant clatter of metal from the kitchen building, to the wind brushing against the outer walls, and beneath all of it there was something new, not a sound, not a sensation, but an absence, the absence of tension that had once filled every waking moment. And she sat up slowly, pulling her coat closer around her shoulders, her eyes scanning the room as the others began to stir. And Greta Hoffman turned on her bunk, blinking against the dim light, her first breath deeper than usual, as if her body had allowed itself something it had denied for months. And no one spoke immediately, because the morning carried a question none of them wanted to rush, a question about whether yesterday had been an exception or the beginning of something that could not yet be named. And outside in the yard the guards moved through their routine with a precision that looked unchanged, boots striking the ground in measured rhythm, voices low and controlled. But there was a difference in the way they looked toward the barracks, not directly, not long enough to be obvious, but enough to suggest awareness, as if the memory of the previous day had settled into their posture, adjusting it by degrees. And the young guard who had lingered before stood near the gate again, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the ground in front of him. And when the women were called out for the morning count, the formation was the same, lines straight, spacing exact, but the stillness was different, no longer held against something, but held within something. And Anna took her place at the front without hesitation, her shoulders relaxed in a way that did not diminish her presence. And when the count began, numbers spoken in clear, steady voices, there was no disruption, no pause. Everything moved as expected. And yet each person there felt the echo of what had not happened the day before, like a second rhythm beneath the first, guiding the pace without being seen. And Captain Edward Hale observed from a distance, his position unchanged, his expression the same as it had always been, but his attention sharper, not focused on compliance but on continuity, watching for signs of fracture or escalation. And he found neither, only a quiet steadiness that required no correction. And the lieutenant stood beside him, silent now, his earlier questions replaced by observation. And He noticed something he had not considered before. That order did not always come from enforcement. Sometimes it emerged from restraint, from the absence of unnecessary action, and he did not speak this realization. He simply stood with it, letting it settle into his understanding without needing to define it. And after the count, the women were assigned to their usual duties, some to the laundry, others to the kitchen, a few to maintenance tasks along the perimeter, and Anna was directed toward the storage building, where supplies were organized and distributed, a place of routine, of repetition, where time moved in small, measurable units. And as she worked, folding fabric, stacking crates, she found her thoughts returning not to the moment itself, but to the space around it, the seconds before and after, the way the air had felt, the way silence had held without breaking. And she realized that what had changed was not the structure of the camp, not the rules or the roles, but the way. Those within it understood their own presence, no longer defined entirely by what could be taken, but by what could be held. And this understanding did not make the day easier, did not soften the cold or lighten the workload, but it altered something internal, something steady. And as the hours passed, the routine continued, meals served, tasks completed, the ordinary rhythm of a place designed for control. And yet within that rhythm there was now a space, small but real, where choice existed, where judgment could be exercised. And this space was not visible, not marked by any sign, but it was felt in the way voices were measured, in the way instructions were given without excess, in the way eyes met and then moved on without lingering. And near midday the young guard approached the storage building, his steps hesitant but deliberate, and he paused at the doorway, not entering immediately, as if uncertain whether his presence would disrupt something. And Anna looked up, meeting his gaze briefly, and in that brief exchange there was no accusation, no gratitude, only recognition, and he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, before stepping inside to deliver a crate, setting it down with care, and leaving without a word. And the interaction lasted only seconds, but it carried a weight that neither of them could fully articulate, a weight rooted in the understanding that something had shifted between them, not in status or authority, but in awareness. And as the afternoon wore on and the light began to fade again, the camp settled into its evening pattern, the same as the day before and the day before that. And yet beneath it all the quiet change remained, steady and unspoken. And Anna returned to the barracks at dusk, her steps even, her breath visible once more in the cooling air. And as she crossed the yard, she glanced briefly toward the administrative building, not searching for anyone, not expecting to see anything, but acknowledging the place where a decision had been made that would not appear in any report, would not be recorded in any official account, and yet would remain, carried in memory, shaping how each person there understood the boundaries of their world. And when she entered the barracks and took her place once more, the room felt the same walls, the same bunks, the same muted light, but the space within it had changed, expanded in a way that could not be measured, only felt. And as night settled again and the sounds of the camp quieted, Anna lay back, her hands resting loosely at her sides, and she understood that what had begun was not an event, not a moment to be remembered for its intensity, but a shift to be lived, quietly, steadily, in every day that followed. By the fourth morning the change could no longer be dismissed as a single moment carried by memory. It had settled into the rhythm of the camp like a second current beneath the surface, invisible but shaping everything it touched. And Anna Weiss noticed it not in what people said, but in what they no longer needed to say, in the absence of sharp commands where softer instructions now sufficed, in the way the guards positioned themselves not as barriers but as observers. And the difference was subtle enough that no report would ever capture it, yet clear enough that everyone who lived within those fences felt it with each passing hour. And the air itself seemed to carry it, colder now at just above 35 degrees, with a steady wind moving across the yard from west to east, flattening loose strands of hair, pressing coats closer to bodies. And during the morning count the lines formed as always, precise and quiet. But the stillness no longer felt like resistance, it felt like agreement, not an agreement of submission, but of understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement that something had been established and did not need to be tested again. And Captain Edward Hale stood at the same distance as before, hands behind his back, his gaze moving across the formation with measured attention, not searching for error but for balance, and he found it in the smallest details. In the way a guard adjusted his stance when standing too close, stepping back half an inch without instruction, in the way a prisoner met a glance and held it for a second longer before returning to stillness. And these were not acts of defiance or concession. They were adjustments, calibrations made by individuals who had recognized a boundary and chosen to respect it without being told. And Hale understood that this was not control, not in the conventional sense, but something steadier, something that required less force and more awareness. And beside him, the lieutenant remained silent. His earlier certainty replaced by observation, and he began to see what Hale had seen. That order built on fear required constant reinforcement, while order built on restraint could sustain itself in ways that did not demand attention. And after the count, the day moved forward as it always did, assignments given, tasks carried out, the ordinary structure of camp life continuing without interruption. Yet within that structure there was now a consistency that had not existed before, a quiet reliability that came not from rules but from shared understanding. And Anna was again assigned to the storage building, where the work was repetitive and precise, counting inventory, folding fabric, aligning supplies in rows that reflected a need for order that extended beyond the physical. And as she worked, she found herself noticing the details more clearly: the texture of the canvas sacks, the weight of the crates, the way the light shifted across the floor as clouds moved overhead. And these details grounded her in a way she had not experienced in months, because her attention was no longer divided between the present and the anticipation of what might be taken from her next. And this change was not dramatic. It did not alter her circumstances in any visible way, but it altered how she inhabited them. And that difference, though invisible, was profound. And near midday the same young guard approached again, his steps more certain this time, though still measured. And he paused at the doorway out of habit rather than hesitation, and Anna looked up, acknowledging him with a brief nod that carried no weight beyond recognition. And he returned the gesture, setting down a small crate before speaking for the first time, his voice low, controlled: "Supplies for the east wall." And the words were simple, functional, but the act of speaking them directly to her, rather than through a command or a gesture, marked a shift that neither of them needed to comment on. And Anna responded just as simply, "I will place them." And the exchange ended there, not extended, not explored, but complete in its simplicity. And as he turned to leave, he paused for a fraction of a second, as if considering something, then continued without adding anything further. And the moment passed, but its presence remained, another small adjustment in a pattern that was becoming more defined with each day. And outside the yard carried the same steady rhythm: guards rotating positions, prisoners moving between tasks, the sound of boots on gravel, the low murmur of voices carried by the wind. And Captain Hale walked the perimeter in the afternoon, his steps unhurried, his attention focused not on enforcing but on observing. And he noted the absence of tension where it had once been constant, the lack of abrupt movements, the absence of raised voices. And he understood that this was not the result of a single decision, but of its continuation, of the consistency with which that decision was upheld in the days that followed. Because a line once drawn could fade if not maintained, not through force, but through clarity. And as the sun began to lower, casting longer shadows across the yard, the temperature dropped again, the air sharpening. And the camp settled into its evening pattern: meals served, tasks concluded, the routine closing the day as it always had. And yet within that closure there was a sense of continuity that extended beyond the day itself, a recognition that what had been established was not temporary, not an exception, but part of the structure now. And Anna returned to the barracks as the light faded, her steps steady, her breath visible once more. And she paused briefly at the threshold before entering, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, as if marking the transition between spaces. And inside the room the same quiet greeted her, the same arrangement of bunks, the same muted voices. And Greta looked up from her place, offering a small nod that required no explanation. And Anna sat, removing her coat slowly, folding it with care, placing it beside her. And as she did, she realized that the weight she felt was no longer the weight of anticipation, but of presence, of being fully within the moment without needing to guard against what might follow. And she lay back, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of the ceiling. And she understood that the change was not something that had happened and ended. It was something that continued, sustained by each choice that followed, by each moment where the line was seen and respected. And in that understanding there was a quiet certainty, not of safety, not of permanence, but of something more immediate, more real, that within the boundaries of that place, under the watch of those who had chosen to see, dignity had found a way to remain. The fifth day carried a different kind of weight, not heavier, not lighter, but more defined, as if the shape of what had begun was now visible in the way people moved through it, and the cold that morning hovered just below 35 degrees. The wind sharper, cutting across the yard with a steady persistence that pressed coats tighter and made every exposed surface feel deliberate. And Anna Weiss stepped into formation with the same measured pace as before, her boots finding their place without hesitation, her posture steady not from effort, but from familiarity. And around her the line formed with a quiet precision that no longer felt imposed. It felt chosen, each person standing where they were meant to be without needing to be told. And the count began, numbers spoken clearly, evenly spaced, the sound carrying across the yard and dissipating into the open air. And there was no pause, no disruption, only continuity. And yet beneath that continuity, there was an awareness that had not existed before, a shared understanding that the structure they stood within was no longer defined solely by instruction, but by the decisions made within it. And Captain Edward Hale observed from his usual position, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged, but his attention tuned to the subtle shifts that marked the difference between compliance and cohesion. And he saw it in the way the guards held their positions, not rigid, not relaxed, but balanced, their movements measured without being mechanical, and in the way the prisoners stood, not braced, not withdrawn, but present, occupying their place without shrinking from it. And this balance required no correction, no reinforcement. It sustained itself through the quiet agreement that had formed over the past days. And beside him the lieutenant stood with a different kind of stillness, no longer searching for discrepancies, but recognizing patterns, seeing how the absence of unnecessary force had created a steadiness that could not be achieved through pressure alone. And after the count the day moved forward, assignments given, tasks distributed, the routine unfolding with the same outward consistency, yet internally everything carried a different tone, and Anna was once again directed to the storage building, where the repetition of her work provided a rhythm that allowed thought to settle rather than scatter. And as she lifted a crate, aligning it with others in a row, she noticed the weight not as a burden, but as a measure, something real, something that could be held and placed with intention. And this awareness extended beyond the task itself, shaping how she moved, how she stood, how she breathed. Because, for the first time in a long while, her actions were not guided by anticipation of interruption, but by presence within the moment. And near midday the young guard approached again, his steps steady, his posture aligned with the rhythm that had emerged, and he entered the doorway without hesitation this time, setting down a bundle of folded fabric with care, and he spoke in the same measured tone. "These are for distribution." And Anna responded without pause, "I will prepare them." And their exchange was brief, functional, yet within it there was an ease that had not been present before, not familiarity, not friendship, but clarity, a recognition of roles that did not require distance to maintain. And as he turned to leave he glanced once toward the rows of supplies, as if noting the order within them, and then continued on, his steps blending back into the broader rhythm of the camp. And outside the yard carried the same steady pattern, movement without urgency, voices without sharpness, the environment shaped not by absence of structure, but by the presence of measured control. And Captain Hale walked the perimeter in the afternoon, his pace unhurried, his attention attentive but not intrusive, and he noted how the camp functioned without the friction that had once been constant, how the flow of activity required fewer adjustments, fewer interventions, because the individuals within it had aligned themselves to a shared understanding that did not need to be spoken. And he recognized that this was not a permanent state, not something guaranteed, but something maintained through consistency, through the continued choice to act with judgment rather than default. And as the sun moved lower, casting long shadows across the yard. The temperature began to drop again, the air tightening, and the camp transitioned into its evening routine, meals prepared, tasks concluded. The cycle of the day closing with the same structure as before, and yet the tone remained steady, unchanged by the passage of time. And Anna returned to the barracks at dusk, her steps even, her breath visible once more. And as she crossed the yard, she felt the weight of the space differently, not as something that confined, but as something that defined the boundaries within which she now moved with clarity. And inside the barracks the same quiet greeted her, the same arrangement of bunks, the same low voices, and Greta looked up, offering a brief acknowledgement that carried no need for words. And Anna sat, removing her coat, folding it carefully, placing it beside her. And as she did, she realized that the act itself, simple and repetitive, carried a sense of control that had not been present before, because it was done without interruption, without the expectation of it being taken or altered. And she lay back, her gaze resting on the familiar lines above, and she understood that what had changed was not the conditions around her, but the certainty within them, a certainty that came from the knowledge that the line drawn days before had not faded, had not been tested or weakened, but had been reinforced through each moment that followed, through each decision that upheld it without needing to reference it. And this continuity created a foundation that allowed something else to emerge, not hope in the abstract sense, but stability, a steady presence that did not depend on outcome, but on consistency. And as the night settled and the sounds of the camp quieted, Anna closed her eyes, her breathing even, her body at rest in a way that felt earned rather than granted. And in that stillness, she carried the understanding that what had begun as a single decision had become something larger, something sustained not by force, but by the quiet agreement of those who had chosen to see it and keep it in place. By the sixth day, the quiet shift had become something that no longer needed to be noticed to be felt. It existed in the background of every movement, every exchange, like a steady current beneath still water, and the morning air carried a sharper edge, hovering near 32 degrees, the kind of cold that made each breath visible in longer streams. And when Anna Weiss stepped into the yard before sunrise, the ground beneath her boots was firmer now, the moisture from earlier days locked into a thin layer that held its shape, and she paused for half a second, not out of hesitation, but to register the difference, the way the world subtly changed without asking permission, and the formation gathered with the same quiet precision, lines drawn not by command but by habit. And the count began as it always did, voices measured, evenly spaced, but the sound carried differently now, less like a verification and more like a rhythm, something that marked time rather than controlled it. And Captain Edward Hale stood at his usual distance, hands behind his back, his posture unchanged, yet his presence no longer carried the tension of oversight. It carried something steadier, something that allowed the space to hold itself. And beside him the lieutenant had stopped looking for reasons. He had begun to observe results. And what he saw did not align with the assumptions he had brought with him, because nothing had been relaxed, nothing had been compromised, and yet everything moved with less friction, less resistance. And he found himself understanding, slowly, that strength did not always announce itself. Sometimes it revealed itself in what it chose not to enforce. And after the count, the day unfolded with the same structure, assignments given, tasks carried out. But there was a continuity now that extended beyond routine, a sense that each action connected to the one before it, forming a chain that did not need to be pulled tight to remain intact. And Anna returned to the storage building, where the work had become familiar enough to allow her thoughts to settle into observation rather than anticipation. And as she lifted a stack of folded fabric, aligning it carefully on a shelf, she noticed how her hands moved without urgency, each motion deliberate, not slowed, not rushed, simply placed where it needed to be. And this steadiness extended through her posture, her breathing, even the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, because there was no longer a need to prepare for interruption. And that absence of interruption, repeated over days, had created a new baseline, one where presence replaced vigilance. And near midday the young guard approached once more, his steps now part of the rhythm rather than separate from it. And he entered without pause, carrying a small crate. setting it down with the same care he had shown before, and he spoke in a tone that matched the environment around him. "These are additional supplies," and Anna responded without looking up immediately. "I will arrange them." Her voice even, steady, and when she did meet his gaze there was nothing unspoken between them that required attention, only a shared understanding that their roles did not need to create distance, and he nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, before turning to leave, his steps merging back into the broader pattern of the camp, and outside the yard held the same measured movement, guards rotating positions, prisoners moving between tasks, the sound of boots on ground, the low murmur of voices carried by the cold air, and Captain Hale walked the perimeter again in the afternoon, his pace consistent, his attention quiet but complete, and he observed not just what was happening, but what was no longer happening, the absence of abrupt corrections, the lack of raised voices, the disappearance of small frictions that once required constant adjustment, and he understood that this was not the result of control being loosened, but of control being clarified, refined to the point where it no longer needed to assert itself at every moment. And this clarity created space, and within that space the people inside it adjusted, not because they were told to, but because they recognized the structure they were part of, and as the sun lowered and the temperature began to fall again, the camp transitioned into its evening routine with the same steady continuity, meals prepared, tasks concluded, the day closing without disruption, and Anna returned to the barracks as the light faded, her breath visible once more, her steps even, and as she crossed the yard she felt the weight of the space not as something pressing down, but as something holding steady, a boundary that defined without confining, and inside the barracks the quiet was familiar, the arrangement unchanged, the low voices blending into a soft background, and Greta looked up, offering a brief glance that carried recognition without needing words, and Anna sat, removing her coat, folding it carefully, placing it beside her, and as she did she realized that the act itself had become something more than routine. It was a confirmation, a small, repeated gesture that reflected the consistency of the days that had followed, and she lay back, her eyes tracing the lines above her. And she understood that what had begun as a single decision had now become part of the structure of their days, not something separate, not something remembered only in reflection, but something lived in each moment, sustained by the absence of contradiction, and in that understanding there was a quiet certainty, not of what would come next, but of what would remain, that within the boundaries of that place, shaped by choices made and upheld, there existed a space where dignity did not need to be defended, because it had already been recognized, and as the night settled and the camp grew still, Anna closed her eyes, her breathing even, her body at rest, and the silence that followed was no longer something to endure, it was something that held, steady and unbroken. By the seventh day the pattern no longer felt new, it felt established, as if it had always existed beneath the surface and had simply been uncovered. And the morning air carried a stillness that was not empty but settled, hovering just above freezing at 31 degrees, the kind of cold that sharpened sound and slowed movement without forcing it. And when Anna Weiss stepped into the yard before the first light fully reached the ground, she noticed how the space held itself, not waiting, not tense, simply present, and the formation gathered with the same quiet precision, lines aligning without instruction, each person finding their place with a familiarity that no longer required thought, and the count began, voices steady, evenly spaced, and there was a clarity in the sound that reflected the clarity within the structure itself, nothing forced, nothing resisted, just a sequence carried out as it needed to be. And Captain Edward Hale stood at his usual distance, his posture unchanged, his gaze moving across the formation not to correct, but to confirm, and what he confirmed was not compliance but continuity, a steady alignment between expectation and action that no longer required reinforcement, and beside him the lieutenant stood with a different kind of stillness, his attention no longer divided between rule and reaction, but focused on observation. And he began to understand that what he was witnessing was not a relaxation of discipline, but a refinement of it, a form that required less visible effort because it had been internalized by those within it. And after the count the day unfolded with the same measured rhythm, assignments given, tasks carried out, but the tone remained consistent, unchanged by variation, and Anna returned to the storage building where the repetition of her work had become something steady, something that grounded rather than confined. And as she moved through the tasks, lifting, folding, placing, she noticed how each action connected to the next without interruption, forming a sequence that did not need to be managed, only followed. And this continuity allowed her thoughts to settle into a different kind of awareness, one that did not look ahead or behind, but remained within the present moment. And near midday the young guard approached again, his steps now indistinguishable from the rhythm around him, his presence integrated into the pattern rather than separate from it. And he entered the doorway without pause, carrying a small crate, setting it down with the same care he had shown each day. And he spoke in a tone that matched the environment. "These are replacements." And Anna responded with the same clarity. "I will record them." And their exchange carried no tension, no hesitation, just function. And within that function there was something else, something unspoken but understood, that their interaction no longer needed to be defined by distance or guardedness, because the structure they were part of had already established the boundaries. And he nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, before stepping back into the yard, his movement blending into the broader flow, and outside the camp held its steady rhythm. Guards rotating positions, prisoners moving between tasks, the sound of boots on firm ground, the low murmur of voices carried through the cold air, and Captain Hale walked the perimeter again, his pace unchanged, his attention steady, and he observed not only what continued, but what remained absent, the lack of friction, the absence of unnecessary correction, the disappearance of small disruptions that once required constant adjustment. And he understood that this was not a temporary state, but a sustained one, maintained not through force, but through consistency, through the repeated choice to act with judgment rather than default. And as the afternoon light began to soften, stretching shadows across the yard, the temperature dropped again, the air tightening, and the camp moved toward its evening routine with the same quiet continuity. Meals prepared, tasks concluded, the day closing without disruption, and Anna returned to the barracks at dusk, her steps even, her breath visible once more. And as she crossed the yard she felt the space around her not as something to navigate, but as something to move within, a structure that no longer pressed against her, but held steady around her. And inside the barracks the quiet was familiar, the arrangement unchanged, the low voices blending into a soft background. And Greta looked up, offering a brief glance that carried recognition without needing words. And Anna sat, removing her coat, folding it carefully, placing it beside her. And as she did she noticed how the act had become something more than routine. It was a reflection, a small, repeated gesture that mirrored the consistency of the days that had passed. And she lay back, her eyes tracing the lines above her. And she understood that what had begun as a moment had now become part of the structure of their lives, not something separate, not something remembered only in reflection, but something lived continuously, sustained by the absence of contradiction. And in that understanding there was a quiet certainty, not about the future, not about what might change, but about what had already been established, that within the boundaries of that place, shaped by decisions made and upheld, there existed a space where dignity remained not because it was defended, but because it was recognized. And as the night settled and the camp grew still, Anna closed her eyes, her breathing even, her body at rest, and the silence that followed was no longer something to endure. It was something that held, steady and unbroken, carrying forward what had been chosen and preserved. On the 8th day the change revealed itself in a way no one had anticipated, not through disruption, not through challenge, but through a test so small it could have been missed. And the morning began like the others, the air steady at 30 degrees, the ground firm beneath worn boots, the formation gathering without instruction, each figure taking their place with quiet certainty. And Anna Weiss stood at the front once more, her posture relaxed but precise, her breath steady in the cold. And the count moved forward without pause, numbers spoken clearly, the rhythm unbroken. And Captain Edward Hale observed as always, his presence unchanged, his attention focused not on enforcing but on reading the space, confirming that what had been established still held, and for a time it did, the structure intact, the balance steady, until a minor detail shifted, almost invisible at first. A new corporal assigned to the rotation, unfamiliar with the subtle pattern that had formed, stepping into position with the confidence of someone who trusted procedure more than observation, his movements sharper, his tone slightly louder than necessary, and he began issuing instructions with a rigidity that stood apart from the rhythm around him. Not incorrect, not improper, but misaligned, and the difference was immediate, not in reaction, but in contrast. The space itself seemed to tighten, the air holding differently, as if recognizing the shift before anyone spoke, and Anna noticed it not in what he said, but in how it felt, the return of a pressure that had been absent for days, subtle but unmistakable, and the others felt it as well, their posture adjusting by fractions, shoulders lifting just enough to signal awareness, not resistance, but readiness, and the guards nearby exchanged brief glances, not in confusion, but in recognition that something had changed, and Captain Hale saw it from across the yard, the slight imbalance, the disruption of continuity, and he did not move immediately. He allowed the moment to unfold, to reveal itself fully before stepping into it, because what mattered was not the instruction itself, but how it was received, how it fit within the structure that had been built. And the new corporal continued, his voice firm, his commands precise, unaware that the environment around him was not resisting, but not aligning either, and that lack of alignment created a tension that did not escalate, but lingered, waiting for resolution, and Anna held her position, her gaze forward, her breathing steady, not reacting, not retreating, simply remaining present within the moment, allowing it to exist without giving it more weight than it carried. And this stillness, this refusal to amplify the shift, became the point around which the moment turned, because it revealed the difference between force and structure, between command and coherence, and after a few seconds that stretched longer than they should have, Captain Hale stepped forward, his pace even, his presence entering the space without urgency, and he did not address the formation, he addressed the corporal, his voice quiet, measured, adjust your tone, and the words were simple. Not corrective in the traditional sense, but clarifying, and the corporal paused, his posture shifting slightly as he processed the instruction, not as a reprimand, but as a realignment, and he nodded once, lowering his voice, softening the edge of his commands without losing their clarity, and immediately the space responded, the tension easing, the rhythm returning, not because it had been forced, but because it had been restored, and the moment passed without further incident, absorbed into the flow of the day as if it had always been part of it. And Anna felt the shift as clearly as she had felt the disruption, the return of that steady current beneath everything. And she understood then that what had been created was not fragile, not dependent on a single person or moment, but resilient, capable of absorbing variation without breaking, because it was maintained not by strict adherence to form, but by shared recognition of balance. And as the day continued, assignments given, tasks carried out, the rhythm held, uninterrupted by the earlier deviation, and Anna returned to the storage building, her movements steady, her thoughts clear, and as she worked she reflected not on the disruption itself, but on how it had been resolved, not through force, not through escalation, but through adjustment, through the quiet correction that restored alignment without creating fracture. And this understanding deepened her sense of the structure she was part of, not as something imposed, but as something maintained through awareness. And near midday the young guard approached again, his steps consistent, his presence integrated into the pattern, and he entered without hesitation, setting down a crate, speaking in the same measured tone. These are replacements for the west side. And Anna responded, I will log them. Their exchange smooth, uninterrupted, a continuation of the rhythm that had been briefly tested and then reaffirmed, and outside the yard carried on with its steady movement, guards rotating positions, prisoners moving between tasks, the sound of boots on firm ground, voices low and even, and Captain Hale resumed his position at the perimeter, his gaze steady, his attention complete, and he knew that what had been tested that morning had not weakened the structure, it had revealed its strength, its ability to hold under variation, to return to balance without force. And as the afternoon light softened, casting long shadows across the yard, the temperature dropped again, the air sharpening, and the camp moved toward evening with the same quiet continuity. Meals prepared, tasks concluded, The day closing without disruption, and Anna returned to the barracks at dusk, her steps even, her breath visible once more. And as she crossed the yard, she felt the space around her not as something uncertain, but as something known. Something that had proven itself capable of holding steady even when tested. And inside the barracks, the quiet greeted her as always, the arrangement unchanged, the low voices blending into a soft background. And Greta looked up, offering a brief glance that carried understanding without needing words. And Anna sat, removing her coat, folding it carefully, placing it beside her. And as she did, she realized that what had been established was not only present, but enduring, not because it was protected, but because it was understood. And she lay back, her eyes tracing the familiar lines above her, and she understood that the strength of what they had found did not come from its absence of challenge, but from its ability to remain intact when challenge appeared. And as the night settled and the camp grew still, Anna closed her eyes, her breathing even, her body at rest, and the silence that followed held not just stillness, but certainty, quiet and unbroken. On the 9th day, the change revealed something quieter, something deeper, not in the structure of the camp, not in the behavior of the guards, but in the way time itself began to feel different, as if it no longer pressed forward with the same weight, but unfolded in measured layers. And the morning air settled at 29 degrees, cold enough to sharpen every sound, every movement. And when Anna Weiss stepped into the yard before sunrise, she noticed how the space held its shape without tension, the ground firm, the air still, the formation gathering with the same quiet precision that had now become instinct. And the count began, voices steady, evenly spaced, and there was no hesitation, no disruption, only continuity. And Captain Edward Hale stood at his usual distance, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and beside him the lieutenant no longer watched for errors, he watched for consistency. And what he saw was something that did not need correction, because it sustained itself. And after the count, the day moved forward as it always did, assignments given, tasks carried out, the rhythm unbroken. And Anna returned to the storage building, her steps even, her breathing steady. And as she worked, she became aware of something she had not noticed before, the way her mind no longer moved ahead of her actions, no longer anticipated interruption, but remained where she was, with what she was doing. And this presence altered the way the hours passed. Not faster, not slower, but fuller. Each moment distinct, each action complete in itself. And near midday the young guard approached again, his steps part of the rhythm, his presence no longer separate from the space. And he entered without pause, setting down a crate with care, and he spoke in the same measured tone. "These are updated supplies." And Anna responded, "I will record them." And as she wrote the entry in the ledger, her handwriting steady, she noticed how even this small act carried a sense of clarity, a beginning, a middle, an end. And when she looked up, he remained for a moment longer than usual, not uncertain, not hesitant, but as if considering something beyond the immediate task. And then he spoke again, his voice low, controlled. "It has been quieter." And the words were simple, almost observational, but they carried weight, because they acknowledged what had been left unspoken for days. And Anna paused, her pen resting lightly against the page, and she considered the statement, not as a question, not as something to respond to directly, but as something to recognize. And she said, "Yes," and nothing more, because nothing more was needed. And the exchange ended there, not expanded, not explored, but complete in its simplicity. And he nodded once, a small acknowledgement, before turning to leave, his steps returning to the broader rhythm of the camp. And as he stepped back into the yard, the space absorbed him without disruption, the pattern holding, uninterrupted. And outside, the movement continued, guards rotating positions, prisoners moving between tasks, the sound of boots on firm ground, voices low and even. And Captain Hale walked the perimeter in the afternoon, his pace steady, his attention quiet but complete. And he observed not only what was present, but what had emerged beneath it, a steadiness that did not rely on constant oversight, a balance that maintained itself through the awareness of those within it. And he understood that this was not something that could be ordered, not something that could be enforced, but something that could only be allowed to exist, supported by the absence of unnecessary disruption. And as the afternoon light softened, stretching long shadows across the yard, the temperature dropped again, the air tightening, and the camp moved toward its evening routine with the same quiet continuity. Meals prepared, tasks concluded, the day closing without interruption. And Anna returned to the barracks at dusk, her steps even, her breath visible once more. And as she crossed the yard, she felt the space around her not as something external, but as something she moved within with certainty, a structure that no longer required her to adjust to it, but allowed her to exist within it without resistance. And inside the barracks the quiet greeted her as always, the arrangement unchanged, the low voices blending into a soft background. And Greta looked up, offering a brief glance that carried understanding without needing words. And Anna sat, removing her coat, folding it carefully, placing it beside her. And as she did, she realized that the days had begun to form a continuity that extended beyond individual moments, a sequence that did not need to be marked to be remembered, because it was lived fully as it happened. And she lay back, her eyes tracing the familiar lines above her. And she understood that what had begun as a single decision had now become something embedded, something that shaped not only the structure around her, but the way she experienced it. And this understanding carried a quiet weight, not heavy, not burdensome, but steady, grounding. And as the night settled and the camp grew still, Anna closed her eyes, her breathing even, her body at rest, and the silence that followed was no longer something to measure, no longer something to endure. It was something that held, steady and continuous, carrying forward the quiet certainty that had taken root and remained. On the 10th day, the difference was no longer something that needed to be observed. It had become the way things were, as natural and unspoken as the cold air that settled over the yard at 28 degrees, the kind of cold that made every breath visible and every sound carry farther than expected. And when Anna Weiss stepped outside before sunrise, she did not pause to register the change, because there was no longer a change to register, only a continuity that had settled into place. And the formation gathered as it always did now, quiet, precise, each figure finding their place without instruction. And the count began, voices steady, evenly spaced, and there was a clarity to it that reflected something deeper than routine, something that had been shaped and held over the past days. And Captain Edward Hale stood at his usual distance, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. But there was a subtle difference in the way he observed, not searching, not measuring, simply confirming what he already knew to be in place. And beside him, the lieutenant no longer questioned what he saw. He accepted it, not as an exception, but as a result, something that had been built and sustained through consistency. And after the count, the day unfolded with the same measured rhythm, assignments given, tasks carried out, the structure holding without strain. And Anna returned to the storage building, her movements steady, her actions aligned with the rhythm that had become second nature. And as she worked, she noticed how even the smallest details carried a sense of completion, the way each crate was placed, each entry recorded, each task finished without interruption. And this sense of completion extended beyond the work itself, shaping the way she experienced the hours, not as something to endure, but as something to move through with clarity. And near midday, the young guard approached again, his steps consistent, his presence fully integrated into the pattern. And he entered without hesitation, setting down a crate with the same care he had shown each day. And he spoke in a tone that matched the environment. "These are the final supplies for this section." And Anna responded, "I will update the record," her voice even, steady. And as she wrote the entry, her hand moving smoothly across the page, she realized that the word final did not carry weight in the way it once might have. It did not signal an end, but a continuation, a completion within a sequence that would continue beyond it. And when she looked up, the guard remained for a moment, not uncertain, not hesitant, but present. And he said, "It is held." And the words were simple, but they carried a recognition that extended beyond the immediate task. And Anna met his gaze, and for the first time she allowed herself to respond with something more than acknowledgement. "Yes," she said, and there was a slight pause before she added, "because it was not forced." And the guard nodded, not as agreement, but as understanding, and he stepped back, leaving the space as it had been, undisturbed. and outside the yard carried the same steady movement. Guards rotating positions, prisoners moving between tasks, the sound of boots on firm ground, voices low and even, and Captain Hale walked the perimeter in the afternoon, his pace unchanged, his attention quiet but complete, and he observed not just the continuity, but the stability that had formed beneath it, a structure that no longer required reinforcement because it had been internalized by those within it. And he understood that this was the point where a decision ceased to be an action and became a condition, something that existed without needing to be repeated. And as the afternoon light softened, stretching long shadows across the yard, the temperature dropped again, the air tightening, and the camp moved toward its evening routine with the same quiet continuity. Meals prepared, tasks concluded, the day closing without disruption, and Anna returned to the barracks at dusk, her steps even, her breath visible once more. And as she crossed the yard, she felt the space around her not as something separate, but as something she was part of, a structure that held because those within it upheld it. And inside the barracks the quiet greeted her as always, the arrangement unchanged, the low voices blending into a soft background. And Greta looked up, offering a brief glance that carried recognition without needing words. And Anna sat, removing her coat, folding it carefully, placing it beside her. And as she did, she realized that the act itself had become a reflection of something larger, a small, repeated confirmation of the consistency that had been established. And she lay back, her eyes tracing the familiar lines above her. And she understood that what had begun as a moment had now become something enduring, not because it had been preserved, but because it had been lived, sustained through each day without contradiction. And in that understanding there was a quiet certainty, not about what would come next, but about what had already been proven, that within the boundaries of that place, shaped by choices made and upheld, there existed a space where dignity did not need to be defended, because it had already been recognized and allowed to remain. And as the night settled and the camp grew still, Anna closed her eyes, her breathing even, her body at rest, and the silence that followed was no longer something to measure, no longer something to question. It was something that held, steady and complete, carrying forward what had been chosen and made real. On the 11th day, the change no longer belonged to the camp alone. It had begun to exist within the people themselves, carried in the way they moved even when no one was watching. And the morning air settled at 27 degrees, thin and sharp, the kind of cold that made the sky appear clearer, almost distant. And when Anna Weiss stepped into the yard before sunrise, she did not look around to confirm anything. She simply took her place, her body already aligned with the rhythm that had become familiar, and the formation gathered without sound, each figure steady, each position held without adjustment, and the count began, voices even, spaced with precision, and there was no variation, no hesitation, only continuity. And Captain Edward Hale stood at his usual distance, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, but there was a quiet shift in his observation, not because anything had changed outwardly, but because he understood that what he was seeing no longer depended on him. It had moved beyond his direct influence, sustained by the people within it, and beside him the lieutenant stood with a calm that had replaced his earlier tension, his attention no longer divided between expectation and reaction, but focused on the consistency that now defined the space. And after the count, the day unfolded with the same measured rhythm, assignments given, tasks carried out, the structure holding without effort. And Anna returned to the storage building, her steps even, her breathing steady. And as she worked, she became aware of something new, not in the environment, but in herself, the way her thoughts no longer circled around what might happen next, but remained where she was, anchored in the present. And this anchoring changed the way she experienced time, not as something to pass through, but as something to occupy fully. And near midday the young guard approached again, his steps consistent, his presence part of the rhythm rather than separate from it, and he entered without hesitation, setting down a crate with the same care he had shown each day, and he spoke in a tone that matched the space. "These are the last for today." And Anna responded, "I will finalize the entries." And as she wrote in the ledger, her hand steady, she noticed how the act of writing had become something more than record-keeping. It was a confirmation of order, of sequence, of continuity. And when she looked up, the guard remained for a moment, his gaze not searching, not uncertain, but present, and he said, "It feels different now." And the words were quiet, almost reflective, and Anna paused, her pen resting lightly against the page, and she considered the statement, not as something to analyze, but as something to recognize. And she said, "Because it is understood," and there was a stillness after. Her words, not empty, but full, as if the space itself acknowledged the truth of it. And the guard nodded, not as agreement, but as recognition, and he turned to leave, his steps returning to the broader rhythm of the camp. And outside, the yard carried on with its steady movement. Guards rotating positions, prisoners moving between tasks, the sound of boots on firm ground, voices low and even. And Captain Hale walked the perimeter in the afternoon, his pace unchanged, his attention quiet but complete, and he observed not only the structure, but the absence of strain within it, the way the environment held itself without needing constant adjustment. And he understood that what had been created was not control, not in the traditional sense, but alignment, a state where each part moved in relation to the others without conflict. And this alignment could not be enforced, it could only be maintained through consistency, through the continued choice to act with awareness rather than assumption. And as the afternoon light softened, stretching long shadows across the yard, the temperature dropped again, the air tightening, and the camp moved toward its evening routine with the same quiet continuity. Meals prepared, tasks concluded, the day closing without disruption, and Anna returned to the barracks at dusk, her steps even, her breath visible once more. And as she crossed the yard, she felt the space around her not as something external, but as something she was part of, something that existed because those within it recognized it. And inside the barracks, the quiet greeted her as always, the arrangement unchanged, the low voices blending into a soft background. And Greta looked up, offering a brief glance that carried understanding without needing words. And Anna sat, removing her coat, folding it carefully, placing it beside her. And as she did, she realized that the repetition of this act, day after day, had become something steady, something that reflected the continuity of the structure around her. And she lay back, her eyes tracing the familiar lines above her. And she understood that what had begun as a moment had now become something internal, something that did not depend on the environment to exist, but existed within her regardless of it. And this understanding carried a quiet strength, not visible, not declared, but present. And as the night settled and the camp grew still, Anna closed her eyes, her breathing even, her body at rest, and the silence that followed was no longer something to endure, no longer something to measure. It was something that held, steady and certain, carrying forward what had been recognized and made real, not just in the space around her, but within her as well. On the 12th day, the change reached a point where it no longer needed reinforcement. It had become part of the environment in the same way the cold air and the fixed fences were part of it, present without question. And the morning settled at 26 degrees, the sky clear, the light sharper as it spread across the yard. And when Anna Weiss stepped into formation before sunrise, she did not think about where to stand or how to hold herself, her body already aligned with the rhythm that had formed over the past days. And the others moved the same way, each step measured, each position taken without hesitation. And the count began, voices steady, evenly spaced, the sound carrying cleanly through the cold air. And there was no disruption, no shift, only continuity that had become natural. And Captain Edward Hale stood at his usual distance, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. But his attention had shifted again, not because anything required correction, but because there was nothing left to confirm. What he had observed for days had stabilized into something that no longer depended on observation. And beside him the lieutenant stood with a quiet understanding, no longer analyzing what he saw, but recognizing it as a result of something he had not fully understood before. That restraint, when consistent, could create a structure stronger than force. And after the count, the day unfolded with the same measured rhythm, assignments given, tasks carried out, the structure holding without effort. And Anna returned to the storage building, her steps even, her breathing steady. And as she worked, she noticed something subtle, not in the environment, but in the absence of thought, the way her actions no longer required reflection, no longer needed to be measured against what might happen next, but existed on their own, complete and uninterrupted, and this absence of tension allowed something else to emerge, not relief, not comfort, but clarity, a steady awareness that did not shift with circumstance. And near midday the young guard approached. Again, his steps consistent, his presence fully integrated into the rhythm, and he entered without hesitation, setting down a crate with the same care he had shown each day, and he spoke in a tone that matched the space. "These are the final entries for the week," and Anna responded, "I will complete them." And as she wrote in the ledger, her hand steady, she realized that the act of completing something no longer carried a sense of ending, but of continuation, each finished task leading into the next without disruption. And when she looked up, the guard remained for a moment, his posture relaxed but precise, and he said, "It has become routine." And the words were simple, almost observational, but they carried a deeper meaning, because routine had once been something imposed, something to be followed without question, and now it had become something sustained, something that existed because it was understood. And Anna paused, her pen resting lightly against the page, and she considered his words, and she said, "It was always meant to be." And there was a stillness after she spoke, not empty, but full, as if the space itself held the meaning of what had been said, and the guard nodded, not in agreement, but in recognition, and he stepped back, leaving the space as it had been, undisturbed, and outside the yard carried on with its steady movement, guards rotating positions, prisoners moving between tasks, the sound of boots on firm ground, voices low and even, and Captain Hale walked the perimeter in the afternoon, his pace unchanged, his attention quiet but complete, and he observed not the structure itself, but the absence of strain within it, the way it held without needing adjustment, and he understood that what had been established had reached a point where it no longer required intervention. It existed because it had been recognized by those within it, and this recognition was what sustained it, not authority, not enforcement, but awareness. And as the afternoon light softened, stretching long shadows across the yard, the temperature dropped again, the air tightening, and the camp moved toward its evening routine with the same quiet continuity. Meals prepared, tasks concluded, the day closing without disruption, and Anna returned to the barracks at dusk, her steps even, her breath visible once more. And as she crossed the yard she felt the space around her not as something separate, but as something continuous, something that extended beyond the visible boundaries, because it had taken root within her. And inside the barracks the quiet greeted her as always, the arrangement unchanged, the low voices blending into a soft background. And Greta looked up, offering a brief glance that carried understanding without needing words, and Anna sat, removing her coat, folding it carefully, placing it beside her, and as she did she realized that the repetition of this act, day after day, had become something steady, something that reflected the continuity of the structure around her. And she lay back, her eyes tracing the familiar lines above her, and she understood that what had begun as a moment had now become something enduring, something that no longer depended on circumstance, but existed as a condition, a way of being within the space she occupied. And this understanding carried a quiet certainty, not about what would come next, but about what had already been established, that within the boundaries of that place, shaped by choices made and upheld, there existed a space where dignity remained, not because it was defended, but because it was recognized and allowed to exist without interruption. And as the night settled and the camp grew still, Anna closed her eyes, her breathing even, her body at rest. And the silence that followed was no longer something to measure, no longer something to question. It was something that held, steady and continuous, carrying forward what had been understood and made real. Years later she would not remember the cold with precision, not the exact number of degrees or the way the wind moved across the yard, but she would remember the stillness, the kind that settled not just around her, but within her, the kind that did not demand attention but remained steady and present. And on that final evening of what had become an unbroken sequence of days, Anna Weiss stood at the edge of the yard as the light faded, her breath visible in the cooling air, her posture relaxed in a way that no longer felt new, and the camp moved through its routine as it always had, guards rotating positions, prisoners returning to their barracks, the sound of boots on firm ground carrying softly through the space, and Captain Edward Hale stood at his usual distance, his presence unchanged, but there was a quiet finality in the way he observed, not because something was ending, but because something had fully taken hold, and beside him the lieutenant stood without question, his understanding no longer forming but complete, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to adjust, and as Anna turned toward the barracks, she did not look back to confirm anything. She did not need to, because what had been established no longer depended on being seen. It existed whether it was observed or not. And inside the barracks the quiet greeted her as it always did, the arrangement unchanged, the low voices blending into a soft background. And Greta Hoffman sat nearby, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady. And when she looked up at Anna, there was no need for acknowledgement, no need for words, because what had passed between them over the past days had moved beyond conversation. It had become something understood without explanation, and Anna removed her coat, folding it carefully, placing it beside her, the motion deliberate, consistent, and as she did she felt the weight of it not as something to be carried, but as something that had been set down, not physically, but internally, and she sat for a moment longer than usual, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her breathing steady, and she became aware of something that had not been present before, not a change, not a shift, but a completion, the sense that what had begun had reached its full form, not through action, not through declaration, but through continuity, through the quiet repetition of days that had held without interruption. And she lay back, her eyes tracing the familiar lines above her, and she realized that the moment that had started it all was no longer something separate, no longer something that stood apart from the rest. It had dissolved into everything that followed, becoming part of the structure of her memory, not as a single point, but as a foundation, and outside the yard settled into silence, the movement slowing, the sounds fading, until only the steady presence of the space remained, and Captain Hale turned at last, his steps measured as he walked away from the perimeter, not because his presence was no longer needed, but because what had been established no longer required constant attention. And the lieutenant followed without question, his understanding carried not in words, but in the way he moved, the way he held himself within the space that had been shaped by decisions made and upheld. And inside the barracks the quiet deepened, the low voices fading as the night settled, and Anna closed her eyes, her breathing even, her body at rest, and she understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken, that nothing extraordinary had happened, no dramatic act, no visible change, nothing that would be recorded or remembered in the way events usually are, and yet everything had changed, not in the structure of the camp, not in the roles they occupied, but in the space between those roles, in the understanding that had been created and sustained, and that understanding would remain, carried forward not as a story, but as a way of seeing, a way of recognizing that the line that matters most is not the one drawn by authority, but the one recognized and respected by those who stand within it. And as the night settled fully and the camp grew still, the silence held, steady and complete, not empty, not waiting, but filled with the quiet certainty of something that had been chosen and kept. And in that silence Anna rested, not because the world had changed around her, but because something within it had, something that would remain long after the fences were gone, long after the cold had faded, long after the moment itself had been absorbed into memory, leaving only the understanding that sometimes the most important thing that can happen is the thing that does not happen at all.